Today's video is about price floors. A price floor is a minimum price. You're not allowed to set a price below the price floor. So imagine in the following market, the government imposes a price floor of 5. What will be the effect of this price floor? Why don't you think of the answer before you hear mine? Okay, the effect of this price floor is nothing. The price floor is not binding. The price floor is saying the price cannot go below 5, but the market doesn't want to push the price below 5. So the equilibrium price will still be 10 and the equilibrium quantity will be the same. A price floor below the market price isn't binding and has no effect. In this diagram, the government imposes a price floor of 15 when the market price is 10. This price floor will have an effect. At the price floor of 15, quantity demanded is 70 and quantity supplied is 120. So this creates a persistent surplus of 50. Normally, market forces correct surpluses because when there's a surplus, people have an incentive to lower price, and when you lower price by both the law of supply and law of demand, the surplus will tend to go away. But that can't happen here. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that setting a price floor above the free market price creates a surplus, because producers are going to be happy that the price is high, but consumers will be upset. So producers will want to produce more than they would at the market price, but consumers are going to want to buy less. So if at the market price the amount produced equals the amount consumed, at a price floor above the market price there's going to be an excess of stuff. The key question when there's a surplus is what happens to the excess goods? Who gets them? Where do they go? Or if not all producers are allowed to sell their goods, which producers can participate in the market and can sell their goods? There's not a single answer. It's going to depend upon the particular market. Let's consider a hypothetical market for wheat where the market price is $7. But farmers are not happy with this price. So farmers talk to politicians and they convince politicians to impose a price floor on this market. Let's say politicians impose a price floor of 10, and they're imposing this price floor in order to help wheat farmers. So if they're trying to help wheat farmers, that means that they can't just stop wheat farmers from selling wheat if there's a persistent surplus, because that won't help the farmers. So the government, let's say, imposes a price floor of 10 and it buys up all the surplus wheat. So in this example, there's a persistent surplus of 200 and the price of wheat is $10 a unit, so the government has to spend $2,000 every period buying up the excess wheat. And what can the government do with the wheat? Well, they can't just sell it in the market, because if they sold it on the market, that would push down the market price of wheat, and that would just cause there to be more wheat that goes unbought that the government would have to end up buying. So what the government might have to do is just destroy the wheat. Governments in rich countries often mess with the market in order to help farmers. I don't know why they do that, but farmers seem to have a lot of political power in rich democracies. I have a question for you. Do agricultural price floors cost the government more if supply is elastic or inelastic? Why don't you pause the video and think of an answer before you hear my answer? So we're assuming that the government imposes a price floor and then there's a persistent surplus. The government buys the surplus and just destroys the excess food. If the government's going to do that, it's going to cost the government more if the supply of wheat is elastic. The reason is the more elastic supply is, the more responsive farmers are going to be. So when the government imposes a price floor, they're raising the price that farmers receive. The more responsive farmers are to this higher price, that means the more they produce, that means the more the government's going to have to buy up. As you can see in the diagram in front of you, quantity supplied is much bigger if supply is elastic than if it's inelastic, even though at market price, given the way I drew the supply curves, the quantity supplied would be the same with either supply curve. But again, intuitively, elasticity measures responsiveness. The price elasticity of supply measures how responsive quantity supply is to changes in price. So the government's going to try to help wheat farmers by imposing a high price floor and then buying up all the persistent surplus. The more responsive farmers are to this higher price they're getting for their product, the more wheat they're going to make and the more the government's going to have to buy up. So, if congressmen or senators are thinking of raising the price floor, the more elastic they expect the quantity supplied of the agricultural product to be, the more they should expect the government's going to have to pay for this price floor. Let's turn from the market for wheat to the market for unskilled labor. Now, normally in markets, most people make up part of the demand curve. So when you buy wheat, you're adding to the demand curve. But with labor markets, individuals make up the supply curve. You supply your labor to the firm you work for, and it's firms that make up the demand curve. If we're talking about the demand for unskilled labor, then places like Burger King and McDonald's, they're the ones who demand labor. And it's low-skilled individuals are the ones who supply the labor. So let's imagine we've got the demand and supply for unskilled labor in some city, and the market price is $5 an hour. So unskilled laborers are working at $5 an hour, and the market's clearing. That means at $5 an hour, all unskilled laborers can get jobs, and Burger King and McDonald's can hire as many people as they want, so long as they're willing to pay $5 an hour. But then politicians decide, no, this is unfair. $5 an hour, that's just too low. So we're going to impose a minimum wage. So in this market, they impose a minimum wage of $8, and they say you are not legally allowed to hire anyone and pay them less than $8 an hour. Now, Burger King and McDonald's, they're not forced to hire anyone. They're not forced to keep all the workers they previously hired and raise their salary from 5 to 8. The minimum wage does not give you a right to a job at the minimum wage. What the minimum wage does is says, if you work, you cannot be paid less than the minimum wage, and it says to employers, if you want to hire someone, you can't pay them less than the minimum wage. So let's look at the effects of this $8 an hour minimum wage in the hypothetical market in front of you. So when there's no minimum wage, the market wage will be $5 and 1,000 people will be employed. With the minimum wage, well, firms like Burger King and McDonald's want to hire 600 people, but 1,500 people want to get jobs. But that means only 600 people will end up working, because if the demand for unskilled labor, the quantity demand for unskilled labor is only 600, it doesn't matter that a lot more people want jobs, right? Just because you want a job doesn't mean you're going to get one if there aren't firms willing to hire you. So what will happen with this minimum wage is that before 1,000 people were working for $5 an hour. Now 600 people are working for $8 an hour. So that means 600 people, this is crudely at least, 600 people got a raise, 400 people lost their jobs. Now there's another category, and this is the 900 people who are unemployed. Let's define an unemployed person as somebody who would like to work at the prevailing wage but can't get a job. Now, some of these people are people who didn't want to work at $5 an hour but do want to work at $8 an hour. So the unemployed consists of two groups of people. First, they're people who would like to work at $5 an hour but now can't get a job. And there are other people who want to work at $8 an hour but didn't want to work at $5 an hour. Basically, the unemployed is the surplus of labor, and in this market there's going to be 900 people. I have a question for you. Does the minimum wage cause more people to lose their jobs if the demand for labor is elastic or inelastic? Why don't you pause the video and think of an answer before you hear my answer? The answer is, the more elastic the demand for labor, the more jobs the minimum wage destroys. Elasticity measures responsiveness. Minimum wage is forcing Burger King to pay its workers more, and Burger King isn't going to like it. And by the law of demand, they're not going to hire quite as many people. If Burger King is very responsive to this higher wage, they'll hire far fewer people than they did before. If they're relatively unresponsive to the wage being higher, well, they'll hire about as many people and not that many jobs will be destroyed. This is what it comes down to. You're telling Burger King you've got to pay more for each worker. How does Burger King respond? Do they shut down half their stores, in which point a huge number of people lose their jobs? Or do they say, oh, too bad, I guess our profits will be a bit lower, but we're not going to change anything else? At which point almost no one loses their job. Or maybe they do something in between. Maybe they say, well, we used to hire people to wash dishes and we'll replace the people with machines, and maybe we'll move to having, not having human cashiers, but you type your order in on a computer screen. So we'll cut back on labor by half. A lot of the debate in the economics profession over the harm of a minimum wage comes down to the price elasticity of demand for unskilled labor. Economists who think the minimum wage is a good thing will say, hey, look, the minimum wage gives some workers a raise, which it certainly does, and because we think the elasticity of demand for unskilled labor is low, it's not going to cause many workers to lose their jobs. Economists who dislike the minimum wage will admit, yeah, the minimum wage certainly gives some workers a raise, but also claim, no, there's quite a lot of elasticity in the demand for unskilled labor, so that's going to be balanced out by a large number of workers losing their jobs. While the economics profession is divided over whether minimum wage laws are good or bad, I personally think they're horrible. Let me give you some reasons. First, I think there's a lot more elasticity in the long run than the short term in labor markets. Over the long run, Burger King won't open up a new restaurant that it otherwise would have opened, or it'll invest in labor-saving technologies. So you impose a minimum wage, maybe there won't be a lot of job loss for a few years, but after 5 years, the job loss is considerable. And unfortunately, that job loss might be invisible. How do you, no one knows that someone wasn't hired because of a store that wasn't opened. Another big problem with the minimum wage is that it reduces the training that employees receive. Imagine a college graduate has an option of 2 jobs. One pays $80,000 a year and the second pays $50,000. But the $50,000 a year job promises to give you a lot more training. So they'll say, look, we know we're not paying as much as our competitors. We know you could make more than us. But if you're going to be greedy in the long run. And if you work with us, you'll get to work with the top people and you'll end up 10 years from now with a higher salary than if you went to the firm that paid more today. It's very rational for people to accept lower paying jobs if they're going to get more training, and employers compete on this. Employers will do that. They'll say we're not paying as much as our competitors, but we offer better training. Another related problem with the minimum wage is it causes there to be worse working conditions. And this is actually analogous to what happens in rent control and how rent control reduces the incentives for landlords to keep up their apartments. So normally, if an employer has terrible working conditions, they don't have clean bathrooms, the manager yells at you a lot, they're going to have to pay higher than market wages or no one will want to work for them. But if there's a minimum wage that's above the market wage, there'll be a persistent surplus of labor. That means it's going to be very easy to hire someone else if you're willing to pay the minimum wage. So managers don't have to worry about angering workers. They're going to be able to find lots of workers, no matter what. I think there's sort of an analogy to really attractive people in their dating life. If you're really attractive, you don't really have to treat the people you date very nicely because there's always going to be a substitute for that person. Well, with a high minimum wage, managers of places like Burger King are like the really attractive person because they've got a huge number of suitors. There's a persistent surplus of labor. So it's very easy for them to hire a new person if the people they're currently working for them, get annoyed with them. So just as if, there's a large number of people who want to date you, you don't really have to be that nice to the person you're currently dating because you can easily find someone else. Another problem with the minimum wage is that it can enable racism. As I said before, I think that markets, when they're functioning well, pit greed against racism, meaning if you're both greedy and racist, to the extent that you're greedy, that will temper your racism. Let's consider a racist manager for a fast food restaurant. That manager doesn't like people of racial group X. Well, if the manager indulges this preference, it's going to cost him, in a free market situation, because it'll be harder for him to hire employees, or he'll have to pay employees more in order not to hire perfectly qualified people who happen to be in this racial group he doesn't like. So this racist manager will be at a competitive disadvantage. But if there's a minimum wage that creates a persistent surplus of labor, now there's lots of people who want to work there. It doesn't cost the manager very much if he doesn't hire people from the group that he doesn't like. Now, there'll probably be a law against him excluding people from this group, but it's probably also very easy for him just to come up with reasons why he's not hiring from that particular racial group. So I think minimum wage laws are particularly bad for people who are in racial groups that tend to be discriminated against. But the biggest reason that I don't like a minimum wage is that it can prevent some people from ever getting on a job ladder. Let's consider an 18-year-old kid who went to a crappy school. He's really, he wants to get a good job, but he's not worth the minimum wage. Let's say he's worth $4 an hour to an employer, but he's not worth the minimum wage of $8. Well, he doesn't get a job. Maybe in an alternate world where he could get a job for $4 an hour, he would work, and if he showed up on time, the manager would recognize his diligence. He'd get raises. He'd learn more about how the store worked. He'd become more skilled. Maybe he'd get a bit of training, and his wage would go up, and eventually he could join the middle class. But with the minimum wage, he never gets that first job. So if you think of there's a ladder, right? Hopefully, for most people in rich countries, school raises you up past the minimum wage so you can get that first job and you can keep climbing the ladder as you learn more and more in your job. But if the school system failed you and there's a minimum wage, you can't reach that first ladder and you're stuck and you're persistently unemployed. And that happens in countries with high minimum wages. There are pockets of poverty where people who went to crappy schools are never employed. They just stay unemployed their entire lives. I have a final question for you. Sometimes high-skilled workers support a higher minimum wage, even though the minimum wage won't directly affect them. So maybe they're workers earning $40 an hour, and the union that represents them lobbies for the minimum wage to be raised from $8 an hour to $12. Why would this happen? Now, one argument is, they're altruistic. They want to help people who are lower on the economic ladder. Maybe, but be very suspicious when one group is claiming to act to help another group. Usually there's some ulterior motive and they're really helping themselves. So let me rephrase the question. How is it in the interest of high-skilled workers to have a higher minimum wage, even if at the higher minimum wage, the high-skilled workers' market wage is still above the minimum wage? Why don't you pause the video and think of the answer before going on? The reason is because high and low-skilled workers can be substitutes in production. So a company might have a decision. They could say, we can hire a lot of low-skilled workers or a small number of high-skilled workers, and they'll generally do whatever is cheapest for them. If you raise the minimum wage, that makes it more costly to employ the low-skilled worker strategy, and so it raises the demand for high-skilled workers. So a higher minimum wage can benefit high-skilled workers because it causes companies to shift away from hiring low-skilled workers to hiring high-skilled workers. Thank you for listening.